All right. For those of you who may not be familiar, the NPDA supports franchise and independent powersports dealers through education, advocacy, programs, and practical resources, all focused on helping dealers build a stronger, more professional, and more profitable industry. This partner webinar series gives dealers direct access to the companies, tools, and people helping shape the powersports retail landscape with one goal in mind, keeping dealers informed and exposed to ideas they can actually put to work. Today's webinar focuses on one of the most important long-term profit opportunities in a dealership, F&I reinsurance. For many dealers, F&I is viewed mainly as something that happens at the end of the deal, but when it's structured correctly, it can become more than a single deal revenue source. It can become part of a dealership's broader wealth building strategy. That is what today's conversation is about, going beyond the sale. Dealer participation programs, including reinsurance and other profit participation structures, can give dealers the opportunity to participate in the performance of the products they sell. Done correctly, these programs can create new revenue opportunities through underwriting, profit, and investment income, while also supporting stronger cash flow, long-term planning, employee retention, and greater flexibility in claims management. But there is no magic button. Dealers need to understand the structure, the risk, the capital requirements, the timing, the fees, the production requirements, the upside, and whether a particular program actually fits their store. It's a lot of stuff to do. We're joined today by Rob Hefner and his team. Rob works directly in the dealer participation and reinsurance space, helping dealers better understand how those programs are structured, where the value is created, and what dealers should look for when evaluating a program partner. I've personally worked with Rob for, I think, close to 20 years at this point in time, so he's not a new player to the industry. Today, we'll take a practical dealer-focused look at reinsurance, including how these programs work, common misconceptions, what questions dealers should be asking, and how the right structure can potentially help build long-term dealership wealth. Please drop your questions or comments in the Q&A. We'll work them in as we move forward through this webinar. If we don't get to your question at that point in time, then we'll definitely work through those at the end of this. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and presentation will be made available within a couple of days after this on the NPDA YouTube channel. With that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, and I think it has been about 20 years. It's been an awful long time, and we both had a different hair color, I think, at that time too. So, yeah, it's a pleasure being on today and to look forward to reviewing reinsurance structure, where it makes sense for dealers and when it may not make sense. And so we start first with the different types of reinsurance structures. And what I would say, first of all, is this is something, whether it be a retrospective or a retro program, which is not technically a reinsurance program, or it's not a reinsurance program, all of these are gaining a ton of traction. They're being talked about in 20 group organizations across the country. And for us individually, as a company, we've seen a massive increase by percentage of our dealers that are moving to a reinsurance model, say in the last 2 years. And so it's a very popular. The old myths and misunderstandings about reinsurance that existed, say, as little as a year ago, are starting to dissipate, and dealers are having a better understanding and making a more informed decision. So, with that being said, dealer participation structures. The first one is a retrospective premium program, also known as a revenue release program, a wealth builder, profit participation, retro, all of the above. And so the retro program is basically something under the premise of something is better than nothing of nothing. And what I mean by that is it's not a true reinsurance structure. So in this model, you don't own a company, you don't have a separate structure. You really are just participating in a profit participation program. And how that works is the dealer is going to share a percentage of the available underwriting profits that are maintained after claims are paid, etc., on the business that is written through the administrator that is uh, the revenue program or the retro program is with. So the participation program is based on a volume. Usually there's a minimum volume requirement. Usually the retro payments are made biannually, meaning twice a year. They're based on certain criteria. So in a retro program, a book of business is usually divided into calendar year blocks. And so what that means, folks, is that you take each calendar year, and the risk in that calendar year stands on its own. So, in other words, if the first calendar year runs at 120%, it may not affect the second calendar year, so on and so forth. While there are different structures that are out there, that's generally the most popular. As retros have been around for several years, nobody's really deviated too much away from that model. So, you look at each calendar year, and when that book of business earns out by at least 50%, generally speaking, then you have the ability to take distributions out of the retro program. This is held internally, generally by the administrator, meaning that the administrator holds the money and provides an accounting about twice a year or upon request by the respective dealer or dealer group. During that period of time, generally speaking, the underwriting profit earns investment income, and it's generally based on the 30-day Treasury bill rate, which is not bad now, but back a couple, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't much. And so this can be limiting. It really is restricted to that only, so it can be a limiting factor in terms of investment income. Also, there's a minimum volume requirement. So you have to meet certain volume goals per month to be able to participate this in the profit participation program, and it's usually tiered. And finally, this, if there is a distribution, the distribution is taken at ordinary income tax rate. So in other words, there's not really favorable tax treatment that you're going to receive in a retro program. But okay, so now here's my opinion of a retro program. If you're going to do a retro program, you're going to do a reinsurance program. What I mean by that is a retro program is a watered down version of something that you are participating in, but it doesn't give you everything that you need. So it's kind of like halfway there, but not taking full advantage. And if you want to take full advantage of it, you should in a reinsurance structure and not with a retrospective. The other reason for that is termination clauses. So termination clauses in the retro agreements are really opportunistic for the administrator. And what I mean by that is the administrator can has language in these retro agreements that allow them to retain all of the underwriting profit and investment income or sweep it out of that profit participation account in the event that the dealership drops below a certain volume and or leaves that particular administrator altogether. And so when you look at promoters of dealer participation structures, and that's generally folks that work for an administrator or agencies, things of that nature, if they are promoting heavily and strongly promoting a retrospective program, there's generally a reason for that. And I would suggest that it doesn't necessarily benefit the dealer or dealer group. So that's the retrospective premium program. Number two, controlled foreign corporation. So the controlled foreign corporation is a sole owner or uh, an entity that is solely owned by a couple of shareholders. It is not a multiple entity owned by a bunch of different owners. So CFCs are good for an individual dealer or even dealer groups that are going to stay under a certain amount of annualized gross premium, currently at 2.9 million. So what that means to you is that if you are writing annualized gross premium less than that, then you get all the advantages of having a reinsurance structure. What that means is that you form the corporation as a foreign corporation, but you file as a U.S. taxpayer. So the old myth and one of the main misunderstandings about reinsurance that kind of scared dealers away was the notion that you were hiding money offshore, if you will. Well, that's not really the case. It's never been about that. It's about the IRS tax code and taking advantage through a special election of the IRS tax code. Generally speaking, the reason that you form it outside of the US is to avoid the burden of surplus requirements that any US state is going to require for the formation of a captive insurance company. So you form the foreign corporation at a fairly low cost and a fairly low maintenance cost over time. However, you file as a U.S. taxpayer and you take a certain election that says, in the event that your annualized gross premium is less than 2.9 million, then you are going to only pay taxes on the investment income. So as long as the premium is held within the reinsurance structure, generally the trust account, then you're only going to be subject to taxation in that particular tax year on the investment income made off of that. So that is an attractive uh, attribute of a controlled foreign corporation. In this model, the administrator who administers the contracts, whether it be Riders Advantage or anybody else, they are the obligor on the contract. So parties to the contract are going to be the administrator and the customer. So the dealer is not a party to the contract in this example and in this model. So there's no liability that is spread to the dealer itself. It's really an arm's length transaction. The liability starts and ends with that controlled foreign corporation on the dealer side. Ultimately, the insurer or the underwriter that underwrites the aggregate limit of liability of all contracts that are out there in force is ultimately the liability holder in this model. So it's clean. It allows dealers to own something that's not restrictive like a retro. So in other words, in most reinsurance agreements, if you decide, hey, I want to change administrators, you generally can, and you're not losing anything like in a retro model. Third, non-controlled foreign corporation. So in a non-controlled foreign corporation, most dealers in the Powersports network or in the Powersports marketplace are not going to need to use an NCFC. So when these are used, they're used because you are over that annualized gross premium threshold of 2.9 million, meaning that you'd be taxed on the entirety of the reserve dollars. So that would be disadvantageous for the person who had the controlled foreign corporation or had the reinsurance company. So they elect to go with a non-controlled foreign corporation. Non-controlled means that you need a minimum of 11 members to be able to spread the risk. A lot of times in a non-controlled or an NCFC, you have what's called a segregated portfolio, meaning that each individual member of the NCFC only realizes underwriting profit, investment income, and risk on their individual cell or their individual position within the NCFC. So it's very advantageous. It's a little more costly from a fee structure to be able to facilitate this type of a model. But for those that are over the 2.9 million threshold, it makes a lot of sense. In this model, generally speaking, the administrator is still the obligor on the contract, just like in the CFC model. Number four, dealer-owned obligor company, also known as dealer-owned warranty company or DOWC. So this has been a popular structure that has came into place really and gained some popularity really more on the auto side in the last 5 years or so. So what this means is that you're still able to benefit from the favorable tax treatment that you would receive in the controlled foreign corporation in that model, except this is dealer obligor, meaning that there is some liability that extends more strongly to the actual warranty company or the DOWC, if you will. This really works the same way, but the dealer obligor company is a party to the contract as well as the customer. This is filed very similar. The costs to maintain this are a little more expensive than what they are, and we'll get to that in a minute, than what they are on a CFC. And what's not talked about is generally the audit provisions in a DOWC are greater. And so that creates more expense and more potential issues there. So that's the DOWC. Generally speaking, a DOWC is going to be reserved for dealers that are doing significant volume, generally about 150 contracts or more. And finally, you can use a hybrid structure. So, working with the complexities of reinsurance, there may be a hybrid structure that works best for you to maximize your profitability in the structure and reduce or mitigate any tax liability. So, that can be generally reserved for larger dealer groups or groups, but you can use the DOOC structure for certain products and maybe the CFC model for other products. So those are the different dealer participation structures. Yeah,
There,
it's working. Okay.
thank thank you.
Okay, so common considerations in your dealer participation strategy, timing of available cash flows. So timing and amount of distributions. So one of the things that we didn't talk about is when you have the availability or when you decide to take distribution. So that's when you meet a surplus requirement of unearned premium. We won't go into that today. But at that point, in a standard CFC model or NCFC model, you can take a distribution. When you take a distribution, in other words, you just take the money out of the model, you're taking that money at the then long-term capital gains rate, meaning that you are going to be taxed. You do have a taxable event. However, there are certain strategies that you can use to avoid creating a taxable event at that time. You can move it into a B account that's in the name of the reinsurance company, so it's really just an extension of the trust account. And you can take loans, shareholders can take loans against that are structured properly with a market rate in terms of interest and pay themselves back. So there are ways to structure that, and timing of those cash flows are a consideration in that. Investment strategy. So investment models have really, really evolved in reinsurance structures. For a long time, there was with most structures, there was a requirement that the insurance company had for a certain percentage, generally a very, very high percentage of fixed income investment. However, that is starting to become more aggressive due to market conditions. What I mean by that is now there is an extension and there is an availability to be more aggressive with your reserve dollars in the event that you meet certain requirements, meaning that you can invest them in individual equities. You can get access to a larger dollar amount of unearned reserves more quickly. And this allows you a possibility of a greater return. This is something that has really started to come available in the last couple of years, more or less out of necessity. Just like anything else, as reinsurance becomes more popular with the dealer network, it becomes more competitive, right? And so when it becomes more competitive, when you think about that administrator or that insurance company, they've got to do more things to be able to gain that business. Where in the beginning, a reinsurance structure allowed the dealer to make the underwriting profit and the investment income, and that was basically it. So after there was a surplus, but now access to other possibilities of investing, more aggressive investing strategies, have become more of the norm than the exception. And so we'll continue to see a lot of that. There are some companies out there that don't offer the aggressive investment strategies, but they're becoming fewer and further between. So the decision maker has more ability to invest the money how they see fit, how it's distributed, reserve funds versus surplus funds, which I talked about, and being able to use certain trust and investment advisors versus being confined to certain trust managers. Risk management, that's also evolved over time, where we're seeing more of this dealer-owned warranty company model, or DOWC, and that obligor versus a third-party obligor. We're seeing some of that. That really, from a practicality standpoint, on the Powersports side of the business, doesn't make as much sense. There aren't as many advantages, but for those dealer groups that are fairly large, that may be something that you want to look at. You are accepting some obligor risk, and that's a determination in terms of risk management. And your segregation of risk is going to be really, really important in terms of how you manage the overall reinsurance company. One of the things that we see a lot on the power sports side is when the F&I manager is marketing an extended service contract, they're marketing the longest term available because that's something that they see the most value in. However, when you think about that from a reinsurance standpoint and how the claims curve may work, then as you probably know, claim frequency goes up over time, just like this for the length of ownership. So in other words, that risk exposure goes on and on and on. It gets higher and higher as long as the customer owns the machine and owns the contract, right? So the longer the term, the higher the risk, and the longer amount of time that it takes for the contract to earn out. So when you think about that earnings curve in the reinsurance structure, or how that contract earns out over time, if it's a 5 year contract, it's going to earn out from day one for 5 years. If it's a 3 year contract, it reduces the risk of the contract because it's restricted to 3 years versus 5 years. Remember that curve, right? Goes up for the length of ownership. So, given that, your contract's going to earn out more quickly at a 36-month term, and your risk of claim frequency is going to be lower. So, that's
Hey,
one of the biggest considerations when it comes to risk management.
hey, Rob.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think the other one there too, and maybe do you provide some guidance and reporting to dealers? But on different
Yes.
product types, we know that the customers are going to, potentially want to trade in after 3 years. If we're selling that customer a 6 year warranty, then maybe we've got the risk down the road of I want to cancel this or I want to get some money back versus, kind of selling that customer a contract term that's going to be commensurate with how long we think they're going to own it before they're ready to get something new.
Mark, that's no doubt about it. That's a really good point. So, two considerations. First of all, to Mark's point, the trade cycle is the trade cycle, and it hasn't changed much over the years. And so, when you consider that trade cycle, you are ending up having cancellations and you're refunding monies back to the deal, back to the lender, back to the customer. The other consideration is if you, and this is a little bit in a rabbit hole, I won't spend a lot of time here, but in your presentation in F&I, if you are using best practice and you're using some type of a menu presentation, for instance, ITAP, which is the leading provider that we integrate with, and you are starting at the longest term, then you don't have anything to give the customer in the event that there's an objection or resistance. And so that's another strategy where we always teach in the initial menu presentation to go with a median term and general term, and that's generally 36 months. So yeah, some really good points there. Uh, Reserve adequacy is the next consideration. Reserve adequacy. So here's what's crazy. Here's what's crazy. Our overall loss ratios are inherently different for our reinsurance dealers and our non-reinsurance dealers. And what I mean by that is our overall extended service contract loss ratio for dealers that are not reinsurance partners is generally in the low 80s, meaning that, our overall underwriting profit in that model is generally about 18%, which is still something, right? But it's not nearly what it is if it's a reinsurance partner. If it's a reinsurance partner, it dips all the way down in the low 60s. And so you ask yourself, why is that? Why would that loss ratio fluctuation be about 20% with your reinsurance dealers versus your non-reinsurance dealers? And the answer to that is that if you are a non-reinsurance dealer, you're going to support your service department in wanting every single claim paid, whether it's valid or not. So you'll continue to grind. And when we are forced to face that and we don't have the absolute basis to make that denial, then a lot of times we'll go ahead and authorize that claim, which drives that loss ratio up. However, when the reinsurance partner has a say in the claim because they have some of that claim flexibility, so in our model, and I think it's similar with most administrators, the decision maker, usually the dealer principal or somebody that he designates, is going to see the claim when it's been denied. They're going to have the narrative, the information about the claim, and they're going to have a say. They're going to be able to say, hey, yes, I agree with the denial, or B, yes, I agree, but we really want to cover this claim. What we see 9 times out of 10 is that the dealer partner or the reinsurance partner agrees with the denial and upholds the denial significantly at a significantly higher rate than they would if it was non-reinsurance. And so that's the reason you see a fluctuation. Number one. Number two is a dealer looks at reserve dollars. And when I talk about reserve dollars, that's basically your rates after your administrative fees. Those are the reserves that are in the rates to pay claims. They look at that differently. So instead of saying, "Hey, we want to sell the cheapest," and sometimes in that model you can't see the forest for the trees because you get what you pay for, right? With a reinsurance partner, you still have claims flexibility, but you want to properly reserve, have a high enough dollar reserve, average reserve, to make sure that that reinsurance company is healthy. So it really is a shift in how you think about your partnership with the administrator. So some people ask, and I'm already starting to run short on time, so I'm going to pick up the speed. But some people ask, why do you do this? Rob, why do you guys provide structures that allow the dealership to have all the underwriting profit and all the investment income? How are you making money? Well, we become a fee-based company only, right? So we're making the fees per contract and that's it because we're giving the dealer all the other things. But the reason that we love the structure is because it creates a real partnership. So all the griefs that we have to put through, or all the things that we must endure when it comes to claims discussions, when it comes to reserve adequacy, now we have a real partner. We're really aligned. We're really aligned. What was it that George H.W. Bush said years and years ago? Mark, you probably remember this: 1,000 points of light, right? So we're aligned. And so all of those debates and those back and forth, they kind of go away in this model. And so it really creates a more, and I'm actually going to say this, harmonious. I know that's, yeah, let's sing Kumbaya, right?
I,
Harmonious. Yeah, a
I just
harmonious
want
partnership.
I just want to say that I think Dana Carvey said it better than George W. Bush.
I
That,
completely agree with you. Yeah, I mean, I can
that,
still see
that
that in my head. It was freaking classic. Yeah,
1,000 points
yeah,
of light.
yeah. Okay, F&I development strategy. I talked a little bit about that. Structure taxation. Talked about the deferral versus long term. So I'm not going to spend more time. Shareholder level taxation. That's a consideration. When you look at a shareholder, the timing and character, again, there are some considerations. That's probably more of an in-depth conversation we have time for today. But I do want to spend a few minutes on ownership structure. So when you're considering ownership structure with a reinsurance company, remember it's an arm's length transaction. So the dealership, if it's administrator obligor, or even a DOWC for that matter, it's still an arm's length transaction because it's the actual warranty company that's the obligor, but it's owned by the dealership. So in the administrator obligor, it's an arm's length transaction. So the ownership is inherently different, and they're two separate companies, two separate structures. A lot of times, dealers will use albeit generally a smaller percentage of the reinsurance company as a retention tool for key employees. And that allows them, I always suggest a vesting schedule in this model where they require the key employee to be with the organization over a significant period of time to receive 100% per the vesting schedule. And it really allows that that employee to participate and support the reinsurance structure both at the same time while retaining that key employee. So it's a really great tool for that. So if it did nothing else, if it didn't gain any underwriting profit, which they almost always do, that in and of itself is a great strategy. Actionable intelligence. So in a reinsurance structure, you're more involved, and when you're more involved with the data, because risk management becomes more important, you're more on top of it, and the net result of that is, generally speaking, you're going to have a higher PVR per vehicle retail in your F&I department. And so from that standpoint, it is very, very attractive. Okay, questions before next slide. Any questions?
Nothing has popped up yet, Senor.
Okay. Oh, and it worked. Look at that. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm at 233, or in Mark's world, 1433. So moving on to comparing participation models, ownership flexibility. We talked about the retro. It's simple. It's not a reinsurance structure. It's just an in-house accounting that the administrator provides. It's got some teeth. It's got some restrictive termination clauses. The advantages are no cost of formation. And so this really should be restricted to your lower participate or volume dealers in terms of F&I contract production that are really just looking to have something, but reinsurance doesn't make sense. However, I suggest that that's a very small amount of dealers that are below that level where reinsurance makes sense, but participate doesn't make sense, but participation does. So with a CFC, again, controlled foreign corporation, you have a high level of flexibility. You can make post-formation ownership changes, which we see happen all the time. Trust me, as ownership changes and employees change. It does require some tax consideration. There is, generally speaking, about a $4,500 upfront cost for formation, and then ongoing about $4,500 for your charter renewal and with for your tax return, which is all handled by the reinsurance manager. Generally, you want to do about 25 contracts a month for this to make sense. And a lot of companies will require a minimum amount of premium written per year. NCFC, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on. It has a high level of flexibility. However, the fee structure is generally a little bit higher. This is what we call rent a captive. I won't elaborate on that, but why there is no formation cost, there's an upfront shareholder investment, and there's an additional cost for the manager of the NCFC position. And so it's just a fee that if you don't need this for tax strategy, then I don't necessarily suggest it. And then the DOOC, that's really going to be the same as the CFC, but in this model, it really can be state dependent because there are certain licensing requirements in states that make it more restrictive than others. And as I said earlier, the formation cost is generally around 5,000, but the ongoing annual expenses are going to be more expensive than the CFC. So if you don't need to form a DOOC, you're really better off with the CFC for a lot of reasons. But this is generally a model that can be a better solution than an NCFC for dealers that are doing significant volume. So it's something that you want to look at, and it can be lower cost from a fee standpoint. So next slide. So the fundamentals in just kind of restating in simplistic terms, you gain underwriting profit and investment income with minimal risk. Remember, when we talk about minimal risk, we talk about in a CFC, administrator obligor reinsurance vehicle, your risk starts and ends with that reinsurance company. Ultimately, the insurer who insures the obligations of that reinsurance company would take on the risk in the event that the loss ratio of that reinsurance company exceeded 100%. So you would just really walk away or dissolve that reinsurance structure. So there's no big time liability and doesn't cross over to the dealership itself. There's the favorable tax treatment. So again, remember that with a controlled foreign corporation or with a DOWC, you're taking an election that allows you favorable tax treatment because as long as your threshold stays underneath a certain amount of annualized gross premium, then you're only taxed on the investment income and low startup costs. costs. So remember, your cost for a CFC will generally be about 4,500, and that can vary anywhere from 3,500 to 5,000, depending on who you use as a registered agent. But it's fairly low, and there's no surplus requirements. Advantages. This is significant additional revenue. Again, that's relative to the amount of volume and the amount of reserve that you produce into the reinsurance company. But as I said earlier, generally speaking, when you have formed and you've committed to a reinsurance company, it's funny how this is directly correlated. But all of a sudden, your F&I department is doing a lot better. And you wonder why that is. It's because now you're really focused as a dealer principal. You're really focused to that department. You've got more skin in the game, and you're watching your data. You're watching risk management you're more involved in. You're watching the overall revenue dollars because you're going to receive something called a session statement or a seeding statement on a monthly basis. Some administrators only send it quarterly, but generally speaking, it's sent monthly. And what that monthly statement will do, it will give you basically the status of your account, seeded premium, amount of claims, amount of earned premium, all the above, your overall loss ratio, month to date, year to date, inception to date. So you're always looking at those summaries and you're very aware of what your position is. And so you're just overall more conscious and more involved in your F&I department. Secondly, in terms of additional revenue, that investment income on that underwriting profit can be significant. So think of it like this. So when you think of, I talked earlier about the claim frequency rising over the length of ownership and a curve that goes like that, right? So in the beginning, if you're selling a new machine, they're still under factory warranty. So you've got those reserve dollars, they're setting in your trust account for your reinsurance company, and they're growing, and that continues to grow and earn investment income. And then you start to have claims after the expiration, but claim frequency goes up for the length of ownership. So even at year two, your claim frequency is not as high as it's going to be in year four. So you get this head start per se, meaning that you get to grow those reserve dollars without as high of a claim frequency, and you're making an investment income on that. And so what happens sometimes in a few models, especially in the old dealer obligor model that I don't recommend to anybody for a lot of reasons I won't go into today. And dealer obligor, standard dealer obligor is different than DOWC. I know I'm getting in the weeds here, and I'll come back to the surface here, but the reality is this thing's going to look really profitable when you look at all the premium in there in the beginning. But remember something we call the claims tail, and the claims tail being those claims that start to come in over time. So a lot of times there's a recommendation in terms of tax strategy and earning strategy with standard CFC reinsurance companies is that the life of each individual reinsurance company should be limited to 5 years. And what I mean by that is if you form your reinsurance company now, let's say July 1st, 2026, then July 1st, 2031, you would put that reinsurance company into something we call runoff, meaning that you would stop ceding or putting any premium into that particular position and let all that premium earn out. And then whatever's left over, you'll figure out what to do with it, either take a distribution or come up with some other strategy, right? But if there's no risk contained in that reinsurance company, then you do have a taxable event. But you're really limiting that risk and you're cutting off the potential for a claims tail. So I know I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here. That's a conversation for, outside of this, but that's one of the strategies that dealers can use. Employee retention, we talked about employee retention, making them a shareholder, but putting it on a vesting schedule so that you're not giving them, say, 20% up front, and then they leave 6 months later and they've got 20% of your reinsurance company. Yes, you want to use it as a retention tool for key employees. Claims flexibility. We see a denial. We know who our reinsurance partners are. they get the opportunity to look at the claim in its entirety with all the information and make decisions about that particular claim. So that's a big advantage of a reinsurance company as well. Risk. Sometimes the risks are that your product count, your product penetration is too low, or that you're just not selling enough. So we have one particular dealer that's selling less than 10 contracts a month, but they were convinced at a 20 group meeting that they should be in reinsurance, right? Well, at 10 contracts a month, it's really hard to get there. You have any claims, and then you've got your $4,500 annual fee for your tax return. And is it really worth it? Probably not. Probably not. And really, even a retro doesn't make sense in that situation. So when the product penetration is too low, address that animal first. Hey, what's your retail sales volume? If your retail sales volume is 50 units a month, you can do a lot more than 10 contracts, and that's where you need help there. Employee manipulation. So a lot of times dealer principals will keep their reinsurance structure confidential from their service department. And I think you probably know why. Because if the service department knows that they've got the keys to the castle or they've got an open checkbook, they may be apt to try to take advantage of that. And so having that arm's length transaction between the claim and the adjudication of the claim is extremely important for loss control. Because remember, the service department, they do some of the hardest jobs in the dealership. And so they're very customer facing. And nobody likes confrontation. And that customer is right in their face saying, hey, you better take care of this. Yeah, good, bad, or indifferent, they're going to try to do that, right? So maybe they work over the warranty company or the extended service contract company instead of the customer. Happens. Hidden fees. And so hidden fees are those fees that aren't disclosed in the reinsurance presentation by the promoter of such, meaning that they say, okay, our admin fees, $100, but what they didn't tell you is they've got what's called a loss adjustment expense. And so that loss adjustment expense, generally speaking, is about 6.5% of every claim that they adjudicate. So there's additional expense that's contained in the reinsurance agreement. But remember, as a dealer principal, this is not what you do every day. Some of the things that I've talked about today probably kind of came, over the top, right? I get that. I understand that. And so, because it's not what you do every day, having that transparency of fees and knowing what fees you're going to pay is extremely important. And that's one of the risks that you take. You may make a decision to go with a certain provider or administrator based on X, but in reality, it's Y. And that leads me to the last risk, which is lack of knowledge or complexities. Again, what I just talked about. I mean, this can be a complex, a complex decision based on a lot of presentations and notions and opportunities. And so, being able to cipher through all of that, kind of like today's media, right, allows you to make a more informed and educated decision. So, those are risks. In summary, reinsurance is not as consuming and complex as you may think. It's really simple. I think sometimes we make it hard, and I think guys like me on the administrator side make it more complex than it should be. Dealers that are not currently realizing underwriting profit and investment income may be misinformed. Again, that goes back to all of those misconceptions that dealers have had for years about what reinsurance is and how it can possibly affect their bottom line. The biggest challenge is most often mining through information and determining real transparency. I think that just comes down to trusting your provider that they're going to do what they say they're going to do and what they say is real, and there's no lack of transparency. So, with that being said, Mark, I will open it up for questions if there are any.
Yeah, if anybody has any Q&A, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. But I did have a list that I come up as you were presenting here, Rob, and then in the end, you covered most of them. So thanks for messing that up for me. But got a
No problem.
couple,
Happy to.
couple that you didn't get to, or maybe just kind of digging in a little bit deeper. Any other common mistakes that dealers make when they go down this pathway?
Yeah. So there is a couple of considerations. So first of all, we talked about term. We talked about going with a 36-month term versus selling the longest term. But what we didn't talk about is product mix. We didn't talk about product mix. And so thank you, Mark. I do want to spend a few minutes. And so everybody who's on this call, and really most of the people will watch the call or watch this on YouTube after the fact, will can relate and know that a Polaris RZR is going to have a higher loss or risk exposure than a Honda CBR 1000, right? And so knowing that is important when you are managing risk in a reinsurance vehicle. So it seems counterintuitive, but it's not unusual for, at least if I'm consulting with a dealer, for me to suggest that maybe in some instances on things like a RZR, especially if they're going to be used a certain way, that maybe they're not a good candidate for an extended service contract, or they're not a good candidate for an extended service contract that's going to go into their reinsurance position, something that's almost always going to have claims, right? That can lead to a reinsurance company not performing nearly as well as it could.
I think I've got, kind of the example there. I've got some friends at big watercraft dealers down on the coast, and
Yeah,
um, just selling an extended service contract on a PWC that's going to be used in saltwater, there's almost no chance that
I
that
don't
customer is
suggest it.
not going to get more use out of that.
Excellent example, Mark. Yeah, no, I would say probably, I mean, there would have to be a special exception because those things, yeah, yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, and I'm not saying, and here's the thing, I mean, those OEM programs are out there, and maybe it's a good idea to give the OEM those contracts, but then then you runs into a different set of problems, whereas there's adverse selection going to the OEM, and that's another consideration. But yeah, you got to be careful with that risk for sure.
Is there a cap on, if a customer is buying a $15,000 watercraft and, they end up with a 6-year warranty, is there a cap on the lifetime payouts that are on these contracts?
Very good question. So the standard aggregate limit of liability, so the aggregate limit of liability, meaning the most that the contract will pay, is generally going to be, at least on new, it's generally going to be the retail purchase price of that machine. So if they paid $15,000 for the PWC, let's say, then the contract will pay a total of 15,000 out cumulatively in claim dollars.
Okay.
That's number one. Number two is there's generally across uh, the number of administrators in power sports a per claim limit of liability as well. The per claim limit of liability is, generally speaking, and there's a few differences out there, but it's generally the value that per claim is limited to the value of the machine at the time of the loss. So it still gets pretty expensive, admittedly, but it does help in a situation where you've got an absolute catastrophic claim. And trust me, on that same subject, we've seen post COVID a lot more claims that exceed the limit of liability than we ever did before. It's not uncommon for us to see 11, 12, $13,000 claims, and the machine's worth 7,800. And so those are important that they're in place to really protect the reinsurance position. And if they weren't in place, we couldn't possibly set reserve dollars without significant increases, which would be really bad for the industry.
Well, and I guess, that just doesn't make sense to spend more money fixing something than it's worth. But in that particular example, say someone who's got turbo razor, it's going to be 13 grand to fix the motor and book
Yeah.
value is 8 grand. Are you just going to write a check to the customer for 8,000 bucks?
Generally speaking, yeah, I mean, we're going to write a check to the dealership, and a lot of times that's, we're not naive. Technically, to be able to facilitate payment of that claim, we need a final RO signed by the customer. But we're not naive to the fact that in that event, maybe they take that money in and maybe they cut that check directly to the customer in the event that the customer can't come up with the funds, and they handle it outside of the claim itself for sure.
Okay. There's a question came in on Q&A. Can you give an example of the additional income an average dealer writing, say, 100 contracts a month is potentially leaving on the table by not reinsuring?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so it leaves me, I've got a little more time left and I'm going to use it. And so that leads me to the subject of pro formas. So a lot of times a promoter or reinsurance will provide something called a pro forma. And that's exactly what I would do in this model, in this situation where somebody says, if I sell 100 contracts a month, well, consideration. So when we build this pro forma, we have several assumptions that we have to make, and we can manipulate those assumptions based on whether we want the underwriting profit and the overall return to be higher or lower, right? And so I'm not a big proponent of pro formas. Those assumptions are going to be average reserve dollar, overall loss ratio, product penetration, and the like. And so it's going to vary based on what that product is. So making the following assumptions, you can kind of back into it. So if you got an average reserve, let's say $300 as an example, average reserve at $300, and you are selling 100 contracts a month, then you are looking at roughly $30,000 of reserve per month, right? So if you take that and you say it's a 78% loss ratio, then you're really going to take, and this is considering that all of this 30,000 of premium is ran off, then you can back into that number, and the claims amount at 78% would be 23,400, meaning that $6,600 would be underwriting profit, and any investment income, we usually factor in roughly 4% for investment income as our assumption. Although we've been seeing investment income significantly higher than that based on some more aggressive strategies and market conditions. But conservatively, if you take a conservative approach to the pro forma, use a number of 4%. So if you've made roughly $6,600 a month at 100 contracts, then you could back into that based on how long you're creating those reserve dollars, if that makes sense. And so happy to have that conversation with any individual, but what I would tell you is you can back into that number using those assumptions: average reserve, overall loss ratio, and total number of contracts being sold. And so in the model of 300 average reserve at 100 contracts a month being sold and a 78% loss ratio creates $6,600 of underwriting profit before investment income on a monthly basis.
Thanks for answering that. A couple more.
And I had to do a little bit of math there, just so you know.
Whatever. We know you had that ready.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
What if a dealer has a reinsurance company and then they sell the business, is the typically are you seeing the dealers hold on to these and just let them work their way out, or is the book of
Excellent
business often
question.
sold?
Excellent, excellent, excellent question. Thank you, Mark. Or whoever asked the question. Thank you for the question. So that's really where administrator obligor versus dealer obligor comes into play. So in an administrator obligor scenario, you are either going to buy the reinsurance position or you're leaving it with the selling dealer. You don't really want to leave it with a selling dealer because the selling dealer is no longer going to offer that claims flexibility and that claim service. And so those contracts are coming into your dealership that you bought, but they're reinsured by the old dealer. So the selling dealer can get a higher dollar amount when they sell the store in administrator obligor reinsurance model because really there's a convincing argument that would be made that the buying dealer or the buyer should buy the reinsurance position alongside. Where that becomes difficult is in a dealer obligor model, because in a dealer obligor model, the dealer's the party to the contract. And so that liability has to be negotiated, and it can be a deterrent to the ability to sell the dealership, if that makes sense.
When you sell that book of business, is how is at what level is that taxed or how? I was just
Yeah,
trying to
so
think
when you
about
sell, yeah, so
how a
when you sell
taxable
that
event
book of
that is.
business, you still should be subject to long-term capital gains.
Okay. A couple more questions. So it's, I think, and just kind of knowing this about you and your company, when a dealer chooses to partner with you, you are doing or offering some in-house training. How often do dealers typically see a trainer in the store?
So it varies, and so I'm going to be very transparent. As we've grown over the years, we while we've grown with our training regimen and our training acumen, we've also grown in overall dealer volume. And so we always offer training, but if a dealer doesn't respond positively or doesn't want the training, we're not going to push that on them. And so that allows us to really bring training to the dealers that want it the most. But if dealers are running, not using best practice, running poor numbers, we're really going from a consultative nature. We're really going to try to work with that dealer. And so, in a lot of those models, we're providing training as often as they need in store, full days at a time, 2 full days at a time. That has been something that over the last 3 years we think has, from us individually, Riders Advantage speaking, has really led to significant growth. And the other thing, it's been really rewarding. So I say that. So my answer is that's really based on what the dealer wants us to do for them, but we've been able to facilitate it and meet their needs most of the time. One other thing on that, the team that we have at Riders, I know this sounds more like a sales pitch, and that wasn't the intent of it, but the question was asked and is better than it's ever been. All my folks have got retail experience, and so the ability to conduct that training has greatly improved versus what it has been in the past.
And are you occasionally still offering regional training events, maybe even for dealers who aren't a member of your organization?
Yeah, we just finished one on June 14th and 15th in Nashville, Tennessee, and there were some great testimonials, video testimonials on LinkedIn. It was a unique situation. Of all the attendees, we had 36 attendees. For the first time in, I bet, 8 or 9 years, every single one of those attendees had never been to one of our training events before. We're doing four a year, four F&I training, regional F&I training events a year, but we're also adding fixed ops, which we did in Nashville at that training event, a separate fixed operations training, and we're looking at adding sales training in the very near future. Our next training event will be in November. Location to be determined, and then we have our advanced F&I, which is really restricted to 15 people, and that's a roundtable event. So
And
yes, very active.
the Nashville training on the morning of day two, did you breathalyze everybody or?
Yeah. So in February, we have and a lot of dealers will be able to relate to this because they know, admittedly, we do have a tendency to have, at least in February, our training in Las Vegas. And the reason we do that, because it's always a record-setting event, and it was this last February. And I try to tell everybody on the day before, if you show up with red eyes, I'm going to keep calling on you, and I'm just going to call on you and call on you. And sometimes that works. Sometimes there's a few that stayed up a little late on the slot machines for sure, Mark. So there is always that.
All right, before I ask the last question to you, do you have a way for dealers to contact you if they have more questions or want to learn a little bit more about you and your organization?
Yep, absolutely. So they can reach me at one of two email addresses, either rob@riders-advantage.com, rob@riders-advantage.com, or rhefner@riders-advantage.com, Hefner.
Are you related
Cell
to
phone
Hugh?
number is area code 918-344-1033.
Are you related to Hugh Hefner or?
Been asked that question at least once a week my entire life, and not that I'm aware of, but Who knows, right? But what I
I don't
think I know about my family, it's unlikely.
I don't think that I ever thought about that before. I'm not sure why that didn't come to my mind. So last question before I wrap things up. And I don't, be interested to get your thought on this because I'm not sure if it's even legit or not. But I have a friend of mine, big operation, multiple stores, five
Yes, sir.
stores. And excuse my cat's gonna come to play here now. Um, he has a large reinsurance business, and for tax reasons, he in some cases will just a claim that their insurance company would have paid for. He'll just run that through policy in the business, and feels like he is, he's reducing his profitability today. He's reducing his tax today, and he's going to have these long-term capital gains on additional money in the warranty company. Is that kind of pushing the limits on what's legal, or?
No, no. I mean, so it's another really good question, and so it's not really pushing the limits. Really, when the IRS looks at these structures, especially the administrator obligor model, there's a clean transfer of risk, and as long as there is an insurable risk, then you're fine. But somebody told me this a long time ago. I sat next to an IRS agent on a flight years and years ago, and I don't know how I ended up talking about this, but she said something that always stuck with me. When you take a PORC or a producer-owned reinsurance company and you make it a hog, that's when you've got problems. So, in other words, when you are basically you've got insurable risk based on this amount of reserve, but instead you put in this amount of reserve, that greatly reduces your insurable risk, and now you're using it to basically tax defer. You're using it as a
Yeah.
tax strategy. I can confidently say that in the power sports marketplace, nobody's got anything to worry about. Not in terms of that. The only time somebody's got anything to worry about in the power sports marketplace if they've got a standard dealer obligor program and they're trying to use a reinsurance vehicle with that dealer obligor program because that becomes a listed transaction with the IRS. Topic for another time.
Cool. All right, with that, thanks to everyone who attended today's webinar, done in conjunction with another one of our great partners at the NPDA. Excited to announce that I have, I think, two more of these webinars left at this point in time. So I had no idea so many people were going to raise their hands when we offered this up, but getting close to wrapping up the summer season. As a reminder, the NPDA is here not just to support our member dealers, but also the entire industry. If you're a current member, then thanks for supporting the organization. And if you're not, then please consider joining. You can see on the screen, it's a low cost of entry, and we have a lot of great projects that we're working on right now. Thanks again to everyone who took the time to attend today. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Rob if they relate to him, or if they relate to NPDA business, don't hesitate to reach out to me. With that, I'll call it the end of the day. Y'all have a good afternoon. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks so much.
Bye bye.